Sir Graham Watson, thank you so very much for joining our interview series.
Good to be with you.
Let me start with the first question. Many polls and pundits argue that there's a significant possibility of a far-right surge in the upcoming European Parliament elections scheduled for June 6 and 9. Given the current political climate and recent events in Europe, how likely do you think a far-right victory is, and what would be its implications for the future of the EU?
Well, I think the far right will certainly do better than they have done in the past. The opinion polls suggest that they are growing in a number of countries, particularly in Germany. In Italy, where I'm a candidate, we are seeing a strong showing in the opinion polls from Fratelli d'Italia and from the Lega Nord, who can both really be considered far-right parties. There's Vox in Spain, there's the far-right in the Netherlands. Clearly, there is going to be a larger group from the far-right in the next parliament. The question is whether it will have a majority and whether it can organize itself sufficiently well to have an impact on policy. Because at the moment, the far right is divided between 2 or 3 different political groups and therefore less effective. I think that the mainstream democratic forces will still have a majority in the European Parliament, but they'll have to work together much more effectively if they wish to reduce the impact of the far right.
Mm-hmm. If the far right and populist radical right parties win in the upcoming elections, do you think this will signal the end of liberal democracy as we know it?
I don't think it will signal the end of liberal democracy as we know it, but I do believe that it represents a far greater threat than most people imagine. A lot of people think, oh, well, it's only the European Parliament, it's not national parliaments. They underestimate the importance of the European Parliament in public policy in every single member state. And they underestimate, too, the impact that a good showing in European Parliament elections will have on the national elections in their own member states. I am very worried about the immediate future for the European Union at present, because I see the presence of forces which are not only nationalistic, therefore tending to break up the European Union, but which are fundamentally anti-democratic and are seeking to roll back social progress in many, many areas.
Mm-hmm. In an interview with The Guardian, you argued that the rise of far-right and threats Russia posed to the EU compelled you to accept the invitation to stand in Italy. How serious do you think the Russian threat to the EU is, and how do you assess the strong relations between Russia and far-right parties in Europe?
Well, we see the military threat every day on our television screens in Ukraine. It is true Ukraine is not a member state of the European Union, but it is a candidate country. And an attack by Russia on Ukraine and an attempt to push further into Ukrainian territory shows us that no single European country is safe from the expansionist policies of Putin. Alongside that, we are seeing every day Russian money coming in to help people like Salvini in Italy, Marine Le Pen in France. Previously, Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom had support for this. You know, the Russians are trying to break up the European Union, to re-establish hegemony on the European continent, and people have not yet woken up to exactly how dangerous this situation is.
There are stories in the European media that far-right voters are very well mobilized for the upcoming elections compared to the voters of mainstream parties. What strategies do you believe pro-European parties should adopt to increase voter mobilization, particularly among the youth?
Well, clearly, we, the mainstream parties, have to put far more effort into the campaign. One of the things I think is particularly important is doing what we can to persuade younger people to go to the polls. You know, what we are seeing in recent years is a significant abstentionism among younger people. It was one of the things that led to Brexit, because the older people went out to vote and voted largely in favor of Brexit. The younger people who wished to stay in the European Union did not go out to vote in very large numbers. We desperately need all of those entitled to vote, that's all of those over 18 years old across the European Union, to exercise their democratic rights. Perhaps the younger generation does not quite understand the key thing about freedom, which is that you either use it or you lose it. And if they do not use their freedom to vote and to participate in the democratic society, then the danger is they will lose that freedom for the future.
European Council on Foreign Relations research in March argued that the agenda of the European Union will not be defined by far-right parties as they are divided on their aims and ambitions. Do you agree with this finding?
I'm not sure I agree with it, but I understand where they're coming from. I think their arguments are that the far right is not sufficiently unified at European level, that the parties which comprise the groups in the European Parliament of the far right are insufficiently coordinated, perhaps don't recognize the same priorities as others, whereas the democratic forces in the European Parliament tend to be fairly well organized. They tend to be accustomed to working together, to developing common agendas, to reaching agreement, even when compromises are needed, on policies such as energy policy, policies such as transport policy, where the far right tend to be more splintered and less effective. But I don't think we should allow studies like this, which say, oh, well, the far right are not very effective, to make us any less fearful of what a far-right victory would mean.
Mm-hmm. As a former leader of the Liberals and a candidate running in the EP elections, what are the basic promises you present to the electorate? What are your plans to combat the surge of far-right parties?
I think the most important thing is to make the European Union work properly. We have at present a confederal Europe. A confederal Europe is one in which any country can put a veto on any important policy. And that means that Viktor Orban, for example, is vetoing some of the things we need to be doing in terms of developing a European defense policy to defend ourselves against Russia in Ukraine. We need majority voting, voting by qualified majority in the Council of Ministers, and not allowing individual states to have a veto. And we need, I believe, to see the election of the President of the European Commission by direct election from the people, in the way that the President of the United States of America is elected by, for example, so that there is a proper ideological debate at times of European elections. We need a president elected on a program for government, which is more clearly defined for most of our voters than the situation at present, where individual parties are putting forward their programs, but these are not always very well understood.
All right. It has been announced that the far-right Dutch politician Geert Wilders will be forming the next coalition government in the Netherlands. Do you think this is a milestone in terms of far-right parties' ability to form governments?
Well, I believe they'll not be forming a government on their own. They don't have the numbers to do so. And we already have one case in Europe of a far-right party, the so-called Sweden Democrats, who are in government together with other parties. But in that government, I believe, the Sweden Democrats have no ministers. They are part of the governing majority, but without ministers. I hope that that will be the outcome that we will see in the Netherlands. I think nobody is talking about Geert Wilders as a prime minister, and I hope that his party will have no other ministers. But, frankly, I think parties should not be participating in governments with the far right if it is at all avoidable.
How concerned are you that the mainstream parties might imitate far-right rhetoric to garner more votes? In other words, are you concerned that the values of far-right parties will be mainstreamed by center-right parties?
I'm very worried by what is happening within the European People's Party, where in some countries, their member parties are moving towards the right on policy issues like immigration, on policy issues like abortion or homosexual rights, on issues of tolerance in society in general, in order to try to shore up their own vote. In other words, they're saying, well, we don't want to lose votes to the far right, so we will move on to their policy ground. This is absolutely the wrong way to do it. What these parties need to be doing is defending the society in which we live, the society that has been built on the principles of liberal tolerance against the attack by the far right. In other words, they need to go out and argue their corner much more effectively than they have been, rather than running scared of voters on the far right.
Mm-hmm. The recent assassination attempt on Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico has raised concerns about political stability and violence in Europe. How do you think the EU should respond to such incidents to ensure the safety and security of its political leaders, including the populist radical right and far-right ones, and maintain democratic integrity?
I think this is a big challenge, as we saw in the 1930s. And, there are very few people around who remember the 1930s directly. Politics can be a very, very nasty process. In the 30s, we saw the assassination of fairly significant numbers of mainstream politicians as the far right was sweeping into power. I'm very, very concerned about what is happening, not only with the attempt on the life of Robert Fico, but also with attacks on candidates for election in Germany and in other countries. We have established through the European Union something that is quite rare and quite incredible in European politics, which is a peaceful, secure, stable, liberal democracy. That liberal democracy is now being undermined by forces on the far right, often financed by the Russians, and it's something we have to go out and defend. That's why I'm a candidate. It was not in my life plan to be a candidate again at my age, having served already 20 years in the European Parliament. But I'm so worried about what's happening and about the failure of young people to stand up against it that I've decided I have to take on people like Salvini directly.
Mm-hmm. Considering the potential long-term challenges that the EU faces, including the rise of soft and hard Euroscepticism, anti-European sentiments, and anti-EU political parties, what strategies do you recommend for maintaining the EU's resilience, strengthening European unity, to protect democratic values and institutions across member states?
Well, I think first of all, we have to get across all of the remarkable things that the European Union has achieved, things that many people take for granted. And it's not just things like the Horizon program for cooperation among scientists, or the Erasmus program to give university students experience of being abroad. It's things like the fact that we have in Airbus an aircraft manufacturer which can compete with Boeing in America. It's the fact that we have in our pharmaceutical industry companies which are world leaders because of the freedoms that they had to get together in Europe's single market. It's the fact that if there is a major terrorist attack or major problem, we can move blood, human blood supplies from one country to another with no problems whatsoever. All of these things come about as a result of laws that have been adopted at European level. When I was in the European Parliament, I took through a measure called the European Arrest Warrant, which allows the police from any country to work together with the police in other countries, and the same for our judicial services, to arrest criminals and therefore to deal with the threat of internationally organized crime. But very few people understand these things. And the first thing we have to do is to get them to understand what Europe is capable of achieving, what it has achieved, because we are asking them to give Europe more powers so that it can do even more of these things. But I think, too, we also have to get a little bit smarter and recognize that the far right has done well because they are using social media algorithms, which is a relatively inexpensive way of influencing people, to great effect against the European Union. You know, when you lose a battle, you often lose it because your enemy has better technology. We have to use this technology ourselves to get our message across.
Okay, so Graham Watson, thank you so very much. I appreciate that.
Good to talk to you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.